The Canadian wilderness was not merely a landscape, it was a voracious, consuming entity of white. The specially modified van, emblazoned with the sleek, matte black logo of Ghostmish Media, cut a solitary path through the treacherous logging roads of the northern Yukon. Outside, the temperature hovered at a bone-shattering 30 degrees below zero, a cold so absolute that it seemed to stop time itself. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee, expensive electronics, and the nervous energy of 5 people who had built a career on performative skepticism. Jax, the face of the brand, sat in the passenger seat, scrolling through the engagement metrics of their last upload. He was a man sculpted for the lens' sharp jawline, practiced expressions of concern, and a cynical heart that regarded the supernatural as nothing more than a profitable algorithm. In the back, surrounded by pelican cases and miles of cabling, sat the crew. Elena, the cinematographer, meticulously cleaned a lens that cost more than her first car, her eye scanning the passing tree line with a professional detachment. Beside her, Marcus, the audio engineer, adjusted the gain on his field recorder, testing the ambient noise of the rattling chassis. Chloe, the historian and researcher, had her nose buried in a tablet, reviewing floor plans that hadn't been updated since 1952. Ben, the production assistant, drove with white-knuckled intensity. Fighting the slick ice that coated the gravel beneath them, they were headed to Blackwood Manor. The name itself felt heavy in the mouth. It was a structure abandoned not due to financial ruin, but because of a collective, silent agreement by the local populace to simply forget it existed. Built in the late 19th century by a fur-trading magnate with an obsession for the occult, it sat on a ridge overlooking a frozen lake, isolated by 50 miles of dense pine forest. The rumors were standard fare for their channel: unexplained disappearances, auditory hallucinations, and a pervasive feeling of malice. None of them believed a word of it. To them, Blackwood was just a seta, canvas of rotting wood and peeling wallpaper upon which they would paint their digital narrative of fear for a subscriber base hungry for manufactured adrenaline. As the van crested the final hill, the manor revealed itself. It was a monstrosity of Victorian Gothic architecture, a sprawling infection of dark stone and jagged turrets that seemed to pierce the gray sky like broken fingers. The windows were boarded up, looking like bruised eyes, but the sheer scale of the place was oppressive. The silence that greeted them when the engine finally cut out was not peaceful. It was predatory. The wind did not howl here. It whispered, sliding through the needles of the pine trees with a sound like dry skin rubbing together. Jack stepped out first, his boots crunching loudly on the pristine snow. He inhaled sharply, the frigid air burning his lungs, and surveyed the location with a smirk. He saw camera angles, lighting opportunities, and jump-scare locations. He did not see the way the shadows beneath the porch seemed to stretch toward him despite the overcast sky. He did not feel the heaviness that settled onto his shoulders, a weight that had nothing to do with his parka. The crew unloaded in practiced rhythm, the heavy thud of equipment cases echoing in the unnatural stillness. They were intruders here, modern technocrats invading a tomb of forgotten history. As Elena hoisted the primary camera onto her shoulder, she glanced at the upper window of the central tower. For a fraction of a second, the viewfinder blurred, the autofocus hunting for a subject that wasn't there. She blinked, chalking it up to the temperature shock, unaware that the house had just opened its first eye. The interior of Blackwood Manor smelled of time itself, a cloying mixture of wet plaster, ancient dust, and a faint, sweet undercurrent of something organic and decaying, like flowers left too long on a grave. The team had set up their base of operations in what used to be the Grand Salon. The furniture was draped in white sheets that had yellowed into the color of old teeth, creating a landscape of ghostly mounds in the dim light of their portable lead panels. Technological colonization was their method. They ran cables like nervous systems through the hallways, taped motion sensors to the rotting wainscoting, and positioned static cameras in the corners of the most active rooms according to Chloe's research. The juxtaposition was jarring, the sleek, blinking lights of servers and monitors against the backdrop of Victorian decay. It was an act of dominance, an assertion that their modern reality was superior to whatever archaic atmosphere the house tried to project. Jax stood in the center of the foyer, doing a sound check for his lavalier mic. He was already in character. His voice dropped an octave, his expression somber. He spoke of the tragic history and the dark energy, unaware that the very walls around him were absorbing his voice, not reflecting it. The acoustics were wrong. Marcus, sitting at the audio mixing desk in the salon, frowned beneath his headphones. The sound of Jax's voice was coming through clear, but there was a layer of noise underneath it, a low-frequency thrum, hovering just at the edge of human perception. It wasn't electrical interference. The wave pattern on his monitor was organic, rhythmic, like the slow breathing of a leviathan sleeping beneath the floorboards. Elena was having her own technical anomalies. She was framing a shot of the grand staircase, a sweeping structure of mahogany that spiraled up into the shadowy abyss of the second floor. Through the lens of the red camera, the geometry seemed to resist logical perspective. The lines of the banister appeared to curve inward, and the shadows at the top of the stairs were too absolute, swallowing the light from her torch completely. When she looked with her naked eye, the stairs were normal. When she looked through the digital sensor, the house seemed to be elongating, stretching away from her. She wiped the lens, checked the sensor for dust, but the distortion remained, a subtle warping of reality that made her stomach turn with a sudden, unexplained vertigo. Ben and Chloe were setting up thermal cameras in the library. The room was freezing, significantly colder than the rest of the house, though there were no broken windows. Chloe's breath plumed in heavy clouds before her face. She was reading aloud from a diary she had found in the archives before the trip, detailing the final days of the original owner. The text spoke of geometry that hurts and sounds that possess mass. As she read, Ben watched the thermal monitor. The room was awash of cool blues and purples, reflecting the ambient temperature. But in the corner, near a high-back leather chair, the colors were shifting. It wasn't a heat signature, it was a void. A patch of absolute black on the screen, indicating a temperature so low the sensor couldn't register it. It was a hole in the thermal landscape, roughly the size of a human, and it was stationary. Ben tapped the screen, thinking the pixels were dead. They weren't. The black patch shifted slightly, as if adjusting its weight in the chair. Night fell, not gradually, but with the sudden finality of a slamming door. The Canadian wilderness outside vanished into a wall of obsidian darkness, pressing against the windows with a physical weight. Inside, the only illumination came from the harsh, clinical glow of the monitors and the green beams of the night vision cameras. The skepticism that had armored the group upon arrival was beginning to develop hairline fractures. It wasn't that they believed in ghosts yet. It was that the house felt biologically hostile. It felt like being inside the stomach of a starving animal. The plan was simple: a lockdown investigation. 5 hours of isolation in different wings of the manor, communicating only via radio. Jax took the master bedroom. Elena took the nursery. Chloe remained in the library. Ben patrolled the basement. Marcus stayed at the nerve center in the salon, monitoring the feeds. Separation was the catalyst. Marcus sat alone in the pool of blue light from the monitors, watching his friends as grainy, green figures on the screens. The silence in the salon was deafening. Then, the audio feed from the basement spiked. Ben's channel crackled. Static washed over Marcus's headphones, aggressive and sharp. Through the white noise, a sound emerged. It wasn't a scream, and it wasn't a word. It was the sound of wet tearing, followed by a voice that sounded exactly like Jax's, but distorted, as if spoken through a throat filled with water. "Run, Marcus." Marcus ripped the headphones off, staring at the screen labeled basement. Ben was standing still, staring at a blank wall. He wasn't speaking. His radio was clipped to his belt, untouched. Marcus grabbed his walkie-talkie, his thumb trembling on the button. "Jax, did you just transmit?" "Negative," came Jax's voice from the master bedroom feed, crisp and annoyed. "Keep the comms clear. Marcus, I'm doing an intro. I heard you on Ben's channel." Marcus whispered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "You told me to run. I'm on the second floor." "Marcus, get a grip. It's probably interference from the storm. There was no storm. The night outside was dead calm. Meanwhile, in the nursery, Elena was filming a rocking chair that refused to stay still. It wasn't rocking with the wind. The movement was jerky, rhythmic, unnatural. She zoomed in, her eye pressed to the viewfinder. The air in the room had grown thick, viscous. It was harder to breathe, as if the oxygen was being replaced by something heavier. Through the viewfinder, she saw the wallpaper behind the chair begin to bleed. Not blood, but a black, tar-like substance oozing from the floral patterns. She pulled her eye away. The wall was dry. She looked back through the lens. The black ooze was pouring down, coating the floor. The camera was showing her a reality that shouldn't exist. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prick at her skin. She reached for her radio, but before she could speak, the door to the nursery slammed shut with the force of a cannon blast. The lock clicked, a heavy, mechanical sound that echoed with finality. She rushed to the door, twisting the handle. It wouldn't budge. And then, from the corner of the room where the shadows were deepest, came the sound of a camera shutter clicking. Click, whir, click. Someone was taking pictures of her. But she was alone. Chloe sat in the library, a cathedral of rotting paper and leather bindings. The air here was drier than the rest of the house, brittle and sharp, smelling of ancient glue and the chemical tang of fear. The thermal anomaly, the cold void Ben had spotted earlier, had vanished from the screen, but the temperature in the room had plummeted further. Her breath didn't just mist, it crystallized, coating the screen of her tablet in a fine layer of frost. She wasn't looking at the floor plans anymore. She was looking at the bookshelves surrounding her. They were massive, floor-to-ceiling constructs of dark oak that seemed to lean inward, looming over her like judgmental elders. She had come here to debunk the history of Blackwood, to prove that the occultist owner was just an eccentric recluse. But the books were wrong. She pulled a heavy volume from the shelf, its spine cracked and fading. The title was in Latin, something about celestial mechanics. But when she opened it, the text wasn't Latin. It wasn't even print. The pages were filled with handwriting. Her handwriting, panic, cold and nauseating, bloomed in her stomach. She flipped the pages frantically. It was a diary. Her diary. Entries from her childhood. Secrets she had never spoken aloud. Transcripts of conversations she had with her ex-husband just weeks ago. The ink looked fresh, wet and glistening in the beam of her headlamp. She grabbed another book, a treatise on botany. Inside, photographs were pasted onto the pages. They were Polaroids of the crew. Jack sleeping in the van, Elena cleaning her lens, Marcus smoking a cigarette outside the studio. But the photos looked old, yellowed and brittle, as if they had been taken decades ago. The reality of the library began to fracture. The silence was broken by the sound of scratching, thousands of quills moving across parchment simultaneously. It came from the walls, from the shelves, from the books themselves. The house was writing them down. It wasn't just observing. It was cataloging their existence, digesting their memories. Chloe backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She bumped into the heavy oak desk in the center of the room. On it lay a single, open book. The pages were blank, waiting. A fountain pen stood up right on the paper, held by an invisible hand. As she watched, paralyzed by a terror that froze her motor functions, the pen began to move. It wrote in jagged, violent strokes. Chloe realized too late that she was already part of the collection. She scrambled for her radio, her fingers numb and fumbling. Marcus, Marcus, get me out of here. The library ... It's changing. Static was her only answer. But beneath the static, a voice whispered, perfectly mimicking her own cadence, her own inflection. Chapter 4. The historian becomes the history. The shelves groaned, shifting closer, the aisle narrowing, the books vibrating with the energy of 1,000 stolen stories screaming to be read. Jax was bored. The fear he projected for the camera was a well-honed skill, a mask he slipped on and off with ease. He was standing in the master bedroom, a cavernous space dominated by a 4-poster bed draped in tattered velvet. He had done his scared takes reacting to a creaky floorboard, pretending to see a shadow move. Now, He was just waiting for the segment timer to run down so he could go back downstairs and check the footage. He checked his reflection in the massive, gold-framed mirror that hung above the fireplace. He adjusted his hair, wiped a smudge of dust from his cheek. He turned away to check his phone, but a movement in his peripheral vision stopped him. He looked back at the mirror. His reflection hadn't turned. The Jax in the mirror was still staring forward, eyes locked onto the real Jax. The reflection's face was devoid of the carefully practiced concern Jax usually wore. It was blank, dead. Then, slowly, the reflection smiled. It wasn't a human smile. It was too wide, stretching the skin until it looked like it might tear, revealing too many teeth. Jack stumbled back, tripping over a tripod. What the ... double quotes. He scrambled up, blinking hard, assuming it was a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the toxic mold or the cold. He looked again. The mirror was empty. The room reflected in the glass was the same: the bed, the peeling wallpaper, the window, but there was no Jax. He looked down at his body. He was still there. He could feel his hands, his chest rising and falling with rapid, shallow breaths. But the glass refused to acknowledge him. The room began to feel incredibly small. The walls, covered in damp, peeling paper that looked like diseased skin, seemed to be pulsing. He ran to the door, grabbing the handle. It turned easily. He threw the door open and stepped out into the hallway. Except it wasn't the hallway. He stepped directly back into the master bedroom, entering from the closet door on the opposite side. He froze. He turned around and ran back through the door he had just entered. He emerged from the bathroom door. The geometry of the room had folded in on itself. He was in a loop. He ran to the window, desperate to smash the glass, to let in the freezing air, to prove that outside still existed. He pulled back the heavy curtains. There was no glass, no outside. Behind the curtains was a wall of solid, wet brick. The air in the room was getting hotter, smelling of ozone and burning hair. He spun around. The mirror was no longer empty. His reflection was back. But now, it was standing closer to the glass than he was. It pressed its palms against the surface from the inside. And then, the reflection began to speak, its voice muffled by the glass, yet resonating inside Jax's skull. Cut. Let's do another take. With more feeling this time. Ben was not a brave man. He was a technical hire, good with cables and carrying heavy things. He didn't care about ghosts. He cared about the paycheck. But the basement of Blackwood Manor was testing the limits of his endurance. It was a labyrinth of concrete and rusted pipes, a subterranean industrial complex that seemed far too large for the footprint of the house above. The air was thick with the taste of copper and oil. He had been walking for 10 minutes in a straight line down a narrow corridor, his flashlight beam swallowed by the darkness ahead. He should have hit the foundation wall by now. The house wasn't this big. The physics were impossible. Marcus. He whispered into his radio. I think I'm lost. The layout doesn't match the schematics. The silence in the earpiece was heavy, pressurized. He stopped walking. The only sound was the rhythmic thump-thump-thump of the furnace, sounding disturbingly like a giant, mechanical heart. He shone his light on the pipes running along the ceiling. They were wrapped in asbestos insulation that looked like bandages on a wounded limb. Something crunched under his boot. He looked down. It was a digital memory card, a standard SD card, the kind they used in their cameras. He frowned, crouching to pick it up. It was covered in dust, grimed with years of dirt. The label was faded, almost illegible. He wiped it with his thumb. It read, Ghostmish Camby final dot. His blood ran cold. Camby was his camera. He had the card in his camera right now. This card looked like it had been lying on this concrete floor for 50 years. A metallic clang echoed from deep within the darkness ahead. It sounded like a heavy iron door being slammed shut. Then came the footsteps. Heavy, dragging steps, wet and slapping against the concrete. Ben stood up, aiming his flashlight into the abyss. Who's there? His voice cracked, pathetic in the vastness of the tunnels. The footsteps stopped. A figure emerged from the shadows, just at the edge of his light's reach. It was wearing a Ghostmish hoodie, the same hoodie Ben was wearing. The figure was turned away from him, slumped over, its posture broken and wrong. "Hey," Ben shouted, thinking it might be Jax playing a prank. "Stop messing around." The figure slowly turned. It was Ben, but it was a Ben that had been down here for decades. His skin was gray and papery, stretched tight over his skull. His eyes were gone, replaced by hollow sockets filled with black mold. His mouth was sewn shut with copper wire. The creature raised a skeletal hand, pointing past Ben, back the way he came. Ben turned to run, but the corridor behind him was gone. A solid wall of bricks blocked his retreat. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like fresh blood, were the words, "We don't just record the past. We are the past." The furnace kicked into high gear, the mechanical heartbeat accelerating into a frantic, deafening rhythm. The other Ben opened its sewn mouth, tearing the wire, and released a scream that sounded like grinding metal. Marcus was the anchor, the calm voice in the storm of static, but the storm had breached the hull. The salon, once their fortress of rationality filled with humming servers and bright screens, had transformed into a cage of sensory overload. The temperature had dropped so drastically that the liquid crystal displays on the monitors were beginning to lag, the images smearing into ghostly trails of digital residue. Marcus sat paralyzed in the ergonomic chair, his hands hovering over the mixing board, trembling uncontrollably. He wasn't trembling from the cold. He was vibrating in sympathy with the house. The monitors, which were supposed to be his eyes into the manor's dark corners, had ceased showing the rooms. Instead, they were broadcasting impossibilities. Screen 1, linked to the master bedroom, showed Jax, but not the Jax who had walked in. This figure was standing still, staring directly into the lens, peeling off his face in long, wet strips like old wallpaper, revealing static underneath instead of muscle and bone. Screen 2, the nursery, showed Elena, but she was suspended in midair, her body contorted into a jagged geometric shape that defied anatomy. Her camera fused into her eye socket, the lens whirring and focusing with organic fluidity. Screen 3, the basement, was just black, but the audio meter was redlining, screaming with a sound that Marcus could feel in his teeth, a grinding, industrial chewing noise. Marcus ripped the headphones from his ears, throwing them onto the desk. The silence of the room was immediately replaced by a low, resonant thrumming coming from the walls themselves. It was the sound of a massive hard drive spinning up, the sound of data being processed on a tectonic scale. He tried to stand, to run towards the front door, but his legs refused to obey. The cables on the floor XLR, HDMI, power cords had moved. They were no longer lying in messy coils. They had slithered, tightening around the legs of his chair, wrapping around his ankles like black, rubberized snakes. They weren't restricting him. They were integrating him. He looked down at his hands. The veins in his wrists had turned black. Under his skin, he could see movement, tiny, pulsing lights traveling up his arms towards his brain, matching the blinking rhythm of the server tower beside him. The house wasn't just haunting them. It was downloading them. It was taking their biological distinctiveness and converting it into a format it could understand. Marcus realized with a sickening clarity that the paranormal activity they sought was merely the friction of their analog souls being ripped into a digital hell. He reached for the main power switch, desperate to kill the feed, to sever the connection. His finger hovered over the breaker. The screen in front of him flickered and text appeared, green and pixelated against the black void. "Do not disconnect. Upload at 89%. The shadows in the corners of the salon began to solidify. They weren't just absences of light. They were physical entities, vaguely humanoid shapes made of lagging reality. They stepped closer to the desk, watching him. They had no faces, just smooth surfaces where features should be, reflecting the blue light of the screens. Marcus screamed, but no sound came out. His vocal cords had been muted. The mixer board's mute light for his channel blinked on, a small red eye in the darkness, mocking his silence. Somewhere in the architectural bowels of Blackwood Manor, the concept of separation collapsed. The house, having toyed with them individually, now sought to herd them into the final abattoir. The walls between the rooms dissolved, not physically crumbling, but fading into a mist of gray fog and rotting timber, Aelna stumbled out of the nursery and found herself not in the hallway, but standing on a balcony overlooking the grand foyer. But the foyer was wrong. It stretched down for miles, a bottomless shaft of spiraling staircases and floating doorways. Gravity felt subjective here, a mere suggestion rather than a law. She looked to her left and saw Jax, or what remained of him. He was walking on the wall, perpendicular to her, his movements jerky and looped, like a corrupted video file playing the same 3 seconds of movement over and over. "Jax!" she screamed, her voice echoing with a metallic reverb. He stopped, his head snapping towards her with a sound like cracking ice. His eyes were gone, replaced by twin mirrors reflecting her own terror back at her. "The lighting is wrong," he mumbled, his voice distorted, shifting pitch randomly. "We need to fix the lighting in post-production." From the depths below, Ben climbed up the underside of the staircase, defying gravity completely. He looked desiccated, his skin gray and tight against his skull, covered in the dust of a century. He was dragging something behind him, a heavy, rusted chain that disappeared into the dark void below. "I found the server room," Ben wheezed, his breath puffing out as dust. "It's not computers. It's hearts, thousands of them, beating in the walls." Chloe emerged from a door that hung suspended in midair. She was clutching her tablet like a shield. Her eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large they swallowed the irises. She wasn't looking at her friends. She was reading the air in front of her. "It's a narrative engine," she gibbered, her words tumbling out fast and frantic. "The house creates stories to sustain itself. We are just characters. If we stop being interesting, we get deleted. We have to be interesting. We have to escalate the plot." They were grouped together now on a precarious landing that seemed to be made of frozen breath and old bones. The house groaned around them, the timber shifting like the ribs of a waking beast. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and copper. They huddled together, 5 terrifying caricatures of their former selves, stripped of their skepticism and their humanity. They were no longer a film crew. They were glitches in the system. "Where is Marcus?" Aelna asked, clutching her camera, which had become fused to her hand, the plastic grip melting into her flesh. "He's the uplink," Ben whispered, pointing upwards. Above them, where the ceiling should have been, was a swirling vortex of digital code and spectral mist, and in the center of it, suspended by wires that dug into his flesh, hung Marcus. He was unconscious, his head lolled back, his mouth open in a silent scream. From his eyes, beams of pure white light projected downwards, scanning them, illuminating their fear like a spotlight on a stage. The house was using him to broadcast their terror to something else, something vast and hungry that resided in the spaces between the signals. Panic is a powerful fuel, but acceptance is a cold fire. The realization that escape was impossible settled over the group, stripping away the hysteria and leaving a raw, primitive drive for survival. They had to reach the door, the main entrance, the heavy oak doors they had walked through hours or perhaps years ago. "The doors," Jax rasped, pointing a finger that had lengthened and grown an extra joint. "If we leave the set, the scene ends." They moved as a single organism, a huddle of broken bodies scrambling down the impossible architecture. The house fought them. The stairs flattened into slides. The banisters turned into grasping fingers. The portraits on the walls screamed with the voices of their mothers. But they pushed on, driven by the sheer horror of what they had become. They reached the ground floor. The layout had stabilized, returning to the grim, rotting reality of the Victorian manor. The grand foyer was quiet now, the predatory silence returning. The front double door stood before them, towering and imposing, the only thing that looked real in a world of hallucinations. "Open it," Chloe whispered, her voice sounding like tearing paper. "Hurry, before the next chapter starts." Ben and Jax threw their weight against the wood. It groaned, the frozen hinges protesting with a shriek of rust. Slowly, agonizingly, the doors cracked open. A blast of wind hit them, not the stale, dead air of the house, but the ferocious, biting gale of the Canadian winter. The snow swirled in, pure and white and cleansing. They stumbled out onto the porch, falling into the deep snow drifts. The cold was shocking, painful, and undeniably real. It burned their skin, waking them from the nightmare. They gasped, filling their lungs with sharp, icy air, coughing up the taste of mold and electricity. We made it, Elena sobbed, burying her face in the snow, letting the freeze numb the horror fuse to her hand. We're out. We're actually out. The darkness of the night was absolute, the storm clouds obscuring the moon. The wind howled through the pine trees, a natural, earthly sound that felt like a symphony compared to the whispers of the house. They looked back. The manor stood dark and silent, a lifeless hulk of stone. It looked dormant. Just a house, just wood and stone. The van, Marcus croaked. He had crawled out after them, the wires trailing from his back, severed and sparking. We need to get to the van. Satellite phone. Call for help. They stumbled down the driveway, the snow reaching their knees. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. They were freezing, hurt, and mentally shattered, but they were alive. They saw the dark shape of the van ahead, parked exactly where they had left it, covered in a fresh layer of snow. It was a beacon of civilization, of safety. Jax reached the driver's side door first. He pulled the handle. Locked. He wiped the frost from the window to look inside, searching for the keys he thought he had left in the ignition. He peered through the glass, into the dark interior of the vehicle. He froze. He didn't scream. He simply stood there, becoming as still as the statues in the garden. Jax. Chloe called out, limping towards him. Open it. What's wrong? Jax slowly turned to face them. His expression was not one of fear, but of a profound, devastating confusion. We can't leave, he whispered. We never arrived. Chloe pushed past Jax and looked through the window. The interior of the van was illuminated by the faint, dying glow of the dashboard lights. The van was not empty. Inside, crumpled against the dashboard and twisted in the seats, were 5 bodies. The driver, Ben, was slumped over the wheel, his chest crushed by the steering column, his skin blue and covered in frost. In the passenger seat, Jax's body sat at an unnatural angle, his neck clearly broken, eyes staring unseeingly at the glove compartment. In the back, amidst the chaos of flying equipment cases, lay Elena, Chloe, and Marcus. They were tangled together, limbs broken, blood frozen into dark icicles on their faces. The windshield was shattered. A spiderweb of cracks centered on the impact point where a massive pine branch had come through the glass. The front of the van was smashed against a thick tree trunk. The metal accordion. Chloe stared at her own corpse. She saw the book she had been reading, the floor plans clutched in her dead hand. She saw the time on the dashboard clock. It was frozen at 3:14 p.m. That was the time they were supposed to arrive. We crashed, Elena whispered, her voice barely a breath. She looked down at her hands. They were translucent. The snow was falling through them. Ugh, not on them. We hit the ice patch on the ridge. We crashed. No, Marcus moaned, clutching his head. No, the house. The experiments. The loops. Dreams, Chloe said, the realization washing over her with the force of a tidal wave. Just the firing synapses of dying brains. We were cold. We were dying. Our minds built a place to explain the cold. A house of cold. A house of trapped souls. The reality of the crash site began to override the reality of their projection. The ghostmish van they were standing next to, the clean, intact one, flickered and vanished. They were standing in the snow next to the wreckage. The silence of the forest was absolute. There were no monsters. There were no ghosts hunting them. They were the ghosts, refusing to fade. Jax looked at the camera he was holding, or thought he was holding. It dissolved into mist. We just wanted to capture something real, he said softly. We wanted to film the afterlife. We did, Ben said, looking at his own broken body. Were the footage. As the realization took hold, the tether that bound them to the earth snapped. The illusion of their physical forms began to unravel, dissolving into the blowing snow. The ghostmish crew, the influencers, the skeptics, the content creators fragmented into particles of light and memory. The wind picked up, howling through the broken windshield of the wrecked van. Inside, on the floorboard, a single piece of equipment had survived the impact. It was the main field recorder, its red record light blinking steadily in the freezing darkness. It had been running for 12 hours. It had captured the sound of the crash, the silence that followed, and then, hours later, the faint, confused whispers of 5 voices arguing, screaming, and crying in a house that didn't exist. The battery finally died. The red light blinked once more and went out. The forest reclaimed the silence. The Blackwood Manor on the hill remained dark, empty, and unaware, waiting for the next signal to amplify. But the story was uploaded, not to the internet, but to the cold, eternal memory of the Yukon.